Also, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the SA Tide seminar series. We're pleased to have all of you join us today for what promises to be a timely and engaging discussion on how fiscal policy interacts with commodity price shocks. We think that it is something that is quite topical, not only for South Africa, but for other commodity exporting economies. My name is Abna Labi Odom, and I'm responsible for communications on the SA Tide program. We are joined today by the authors of the featured paper, Dr. Tumisang Loate and Dr. Vincent Dadam, and they'll be taking us through the findings of the paper. But just before we kick off, a few house rules. We would like to ask everyone to keep their microphones muted for the duration of the presentation. It's a 40-minute presentation followed by a 20-minute Q&A. You're welcome to drop your questions in the chat during the presentation. Alternatively, you can raise your virtual hand when we open the floor up for discussion. So I'll hand over to you, Tumisang.
Thank you, Emna, and welcome everyone. And thank you for also inviting us to present this paper that we recently did. And we are also grateful to the reviewers from UNU-WIDER for providing us with very constructive feedback for us to improve the paper. So as I've already discussed, in this paper, we look at fiscal policy and commodity price shocks in South Africa, but this is also relevant for any small open economy. In terms of our research question, what we want to do or to achieve is to basically look at how do fiscal policy transmit global shocks to a small open economy. And in this case, when we talk about global shocks, we're mainly looking at commodity price shocks. So why commodities? As some of you might know, commodities are, composed of a lion's share of South Africa's total exports. So in terms of South Africa, the latest figures that we have for the 2019-2021 period by UNCTAD is that commodity exports comprise of 18% of South Africa's GDP, and in terms of the total exports, it's 64%. And because it's over 60% of total exports, South Africa is actually classified as a commodity-dependent country. Now, what we know from what is the literature and the studies out there is that commodity price shocks do have implications for fiscal policies, especially for commodity-dependent small open economies. Why? Because with commodity price shocks or the commodity cycle, they drive tax revenue and therefore drive fiscal policy. And this has also been documented for South Africa recently during the COVID period. So what we know at the moment is, that, during the COVID period, so the period from April 2020 to 2021. So here we're talking about the commodity price shocks during the COVID period. We have seen, and it has been documented that export commodity prices for South Africa increased by 81%. So here it's in US dollars. And that led to an improvement in the trade balance, which during the same period, it moved from a deficit of about 36 billion rand to almost 58 billion rand. And that contributed to an improvement of about 56% in total tax revenue, obviously from increase in corporate income tax revenue, right? And what has been advocated in the literature is that it's very good for commodity exporters and commodity-dependent countries to always maintain fiscal space during commodity booms and to exercise fiscal discipline. And this, these are the themes that we look at in our paper. So just some aspects about South Africa. So this graph shows that there is a strong positive core movement between commodity prices and real GDP. And what we see here is that, during the commodity boom from the early 2000s up until the start of the global financial crisis, we can see there's been an increase in GDP, which is associated with an increase in commodity prices. And we also see very clearly that during the global financial crisis, both variables basically collapsed. And, if one was to also extend this, we don't really include the COVID period here, but we also see a similar trend. So there is this strong forward movement of commodity prices and real GDP. Now, if we also look at, the correlation between several macro variables and fiscal variables, we also observe, a co-movement of the variables. So now, if you look at, for example, the correlation between commodity prices and real GDP, whether you look at the full sample, and here when we talk about the full sample, we're talking about between 2000 Q1 and 2019 Q4. There is a positive correlation, and this correlation remains even if you look at the shorter sample during the commodity price boom, that is during between 2000 and 2007. Similarly, we do see that periods of high commodity prices are associated with periods of high employment in the private sector, and this tends to be stronger during the commodity boom, so the shorter sample, and a negative relationship between unemployment and commodity prices. Now, when you look at the fiscal variable, so what we do see here, and I'll start especially with the tax revenue, is when you look at the different components of tax revenue, you do observe that whether or not you're looking at the full sample or the commodity boom, the correlation between corporate income tax revenue and commodity prices is pretty much the same. But when you look at, for example, the correlation between personal income tax revenue and during the short cycle, you do see that the correlation is actually much higher during the commodity boom period than when you look at the full sample. And with VAT, the correlation seems to be much higher when you look at the full sample, and pretty much while positive is zero when you look at the period of the commodity boom. And interestingly, when you look at government spending, so when you look at the full sample, you do see that there's a negative relationship between government spending on commodity prices. But when you look at this correlation during the commodity price boom, there is a positive correlation. So which means that when you look at the fiscal variables, so government spending and tax revenue, you do sort of see that at least during the 2000 to 2007 commodity price boom, periods of high commodity prices were associated not only with increase in tax revenue, but also increase in government spending. Now, another important variable that we put emphasis on in this paper is unemployment. And this is because unemployment is a very big problem in South Africa. And that is because unemployment has been mainly structural in South Africa, and the current statistics show that during the 2025 Q1 period, overall unemployment is at 32.9%, and it's at 62.4% when you look at youth unemployment. So these are people between the ages of 15 and 34 years. So for this group, which is classified as youth unemployment, or rather actually ages between 15 and 24 years. So you do see that the unemployment for this group is even much higher than overall unemployment. And to also show that unemployment is is very stubborn in South Africa, even during the period of the commodity boom, where there was high economic growth, right? Even in 2006, when unemployment, or economic growth was at its highest, at 5.5%, you still had a very high unemployment rate of 22.6%. And this persistence in unemployment in South Africa has also been documented by PhD and Dadam, and Vincent will expand more on that. Now, what we do in this paper, we do two things. So firstly, we use an empirical approach to look at what are the effects of commodity price shocks on the South African economy using a medium-sized model. And then we then explore the channels through which this shock is transmitted to the rest of the economy using a DSGE model. And here we follow the framework by Gali and Monatelli, 2005. And what we do is we augment this model with fiscal blocks and also hysteresis in the labor market. And again, Vince will expand more on why we model hysteresis in South Africa. And the aim of the theoretical approach is to basically explore the transmission channels and also to look at how fiscal policy does affect this or acts as a transmission channel in itself. So how does it affect the transmission of fiscal shocks to the rest of the economy? So in terms of our research question and motivation, so what we do, just to summarize, is basically looking at how does fiscal policy transmit global shocks, again here commodity prices, to the South African economy. And why we do that, because we have observed that there is a strong movement of commodity prices and economic activity, but also that it has been documented that South Africa, like with other commodity-dependent countries, when you have high commodity prices, you tend to have high revenue, tax revenue, mainly driven by corporate income tax revenue in the case of South Africa, as has been documented by Vincent and Vincent 2023. And there is also empirical evidence that fiscal policy in South Africa tends to be pro-cyclical. And here, South Africa has been included as in a panel of countries, and the papers do show that there is some element of fiscal policy pro-cyclicality, whether you're looking at government spending or the budget or balance or the primary balance. And in terms of the studies that look at South Africa, and most of them include South Africa in the panel of countries that they look at, what we have noted is that the papers do not necessarily account for fiscal variables. So we, in this paper, account for fiscal variables. Not only do we look at South Africa as a country and not in a panel, but we also include fiscal variables in our paper. And there's also this evidence that it is very important that fiscal discipline is practiced, because if that's not practiced, then fiscal policy can actually exacerbate negative commodity price shocks to the economy. Hence, fiscal policy can be a transmission mechanism of commodity shocks to the economy. Just to give a summary of our results from our empirical analysis, what we do find is that, we look at a positive commodity price shock, so increase in commodity prices, they do have an expansionary effect on the economy in the short run, so the effects are very short-lived. We do see that, you have a positive effect on real GDP and employment, and also tax revenue does increase, but we also find is that there isn't any significant effect on unemployment. In terms of our DSGE model, our results do corroborate the empirical results, and what we do explore in this DSGE model is how is the shock propagated to the economy when the commodity sector is taxed lower or higher than the non-commodity sector, and we also explore the role of hysteresis in transmitting the shocks to the economy. In terms of the literature review, so there are papers out there. They have looked at the transmission of foreign shocks to more open economies that are commodity exporters. The first two papers by Husa and co-authors, and Naraidu and Paez Farrell. So those are the papers that include South Africa in their studies, and the one that we follow closely is the one by Naredi and Pius Farrell, because in this paper, they look at how the multi-price stocks are transmitted to the economy, but here they look at a group of emerging markets, so would include Brazil, Mexico, Chile, and South Africa. And the other literature that we also look at is the one on the cyclicality of fiscal policy in commodity exporting countries. As indicated, fiscal policy, if countries do not exercise fiscal discipline, then we might see fiscal policy exacerbating commodity price shocks in the economy. And as I've already mentioned, that there is some evidence of pro-cyclical fiscal policy in South Africa instead of what one would expect, more of a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So we contribute to the literature, especially the South African literature, in two ways. So the first paper that we sort of improve on is the one by Naredi and Pius Farrell. So in this paper, so we take this as our base model, so the empirical model. So in this paper, they have a 7-variable VAR model. We add to this paper the fiscal variables, which they do not have in their model. And we also model the labor market differently to what they do, where they use search and matching. We use hysteresis. We do this following the empirical evidence by Viedi and Dadam. Empirical model that we use is a Bayesian structural VAR model by Giannini and co-authors, and here we have our YT, which is our endogenous variables. But what we do in the paper, we also control for date. And the motivation for including dates in these models and the so-called fiscal VAR models is, to make the empirical model more in line with your theoretical model, so your DSBE model. So we include date as an exogenous variable in the paper, and where date is basically given by the second equation, which is the interest on your previous debt plus the primary balance, and there the primary balance is the difference between the tax revenue that's collected and government spending. So in terms of the data, we run the model using year-on-year growth rates and accept variables that are already in percentages. And we do follow the, mainly the fiscal VAR models in terms of which variables to include in our model. So our model has 10 variables, and it's quarterly. We use quarterly data, right? And because we use quarterly data, we were restricted in terms of the number of legs to include. So we run the model with only two legs, right? And for robustness tests, we do control for the global financial crisis, and here we use a measure of world interest rate, so which is used in the literature, which is a BA spread, and we do this robustness test just to see if, when we look at the commodity price chart, are we not capturing other global, so just to make sure that we do still find significant effects even if we control for other global shocks. And then we also run the model in log levels, which is more in line with what Naredi and Pius Farrell did, just to compare the results and see if there are any changes. Okay, so in terms of our benchmark results, what we do find is that, a positive commodity price shock will lead to increase in commodity prices, and that would then lead to, an improvement of the trade balance, right? So you have a commodity price shock that would increase the value of your exports, Therefore, you have a positive effect on the trade balance, which would then lead to an increase in your real GDP. Because you have an increase in real GDP, tax revenue would increase, and I mean the increase in tax revenue would come from one, increase in corporate income tax because of higher export earnings for those who for the commodity exporters, and also because the economy is doing well, employment increases, then you have more people employed, therefore you would also have a much higher personal income tax revenue. What we also see here is, because of the expansionary effect, then you have, an increase in inflation, which the policymakers would respond in an inflation targeting economy with an increase in the policy rate. We also see an appreciation of the local currency, which is in line with what others find in the literature, because when you have a positive commodity price shock, you tend to also have capital inflows, which would then lead to an appreciation of the local currency. What we know with the government spending is that even though it's not significant, there is some element of pro-cyclicality, though with the delayed response that government spending does increase. And lastly, we do note that long-term rates. And here long-term rates are the yields on government bonds with more than 10 years. So with 10 years and over, in terms of maturity, that the years do increase on impact. And how we interpreting this is that this could be due to perhaps lower demand for long-term bonds because of higher interest rates. We then run the same model, so the same variables, but here instead of having tax revenue and government spending, we then have the primary balance. And what we do see is, the results are pretty much the same. So you do see an improvement in the primary balance, and that's because same as with the model, it's because we have a much higher tax revenue. And when you also replace real GDP with productivity in the manufacturing sector, you also see that productivity does increase. And what we find is that whether we use unemployment or hysteresis, which is another measure of unemployment, we do not find any significant effect of the commodity price shocks on unemployment. But what we know, and when we compare results to others, for example, with Naridi and Payet-Farrell, they actually do find a significant effect of the commodity price shocks on unemployment. And I think Vincent will expand more on the results on unemployment. Lastly, when we look at do some robustness checks, we do see that our results pretty much remain robust to controlling forward interest rates, so the BAA spread, and also running the model in log levels. So overall, we do find that commodity price shocks do have an expansionary effect on the economy. I think I will now hand over to Vince to go through the model.
All right. Thank you, Tumi. I will share my screen in a moment. All right. I will just pick up where Tumi left. So thank you for the handover. The first thing that I wanted to mention is that is to go back to the finding of hysteresis being not significant, which is quite unfortunate regarding our expectations, right? But I want to give you a motivation to why we decided to still model it in our DSG models, because we believe that it's something that is happening in the economy. And one of the strong motivation for this is this graph that you have on your screen at the moment. We did a work last year with Prof. Vieji, where we're exploring the hysteresis issue in the labor market in South Africa. So pretty much what we did is that we took the unemployment series and then we decided to derive some kind of index where we get some kind of nonlinear correlation, or rather nonlinear sort of series of the unemployment itself. And in the process of doing that, the idea is just to have that certain shocks have bigger impact on the unemployment series as opposed to others, right? So the unemployment series has some kind of memory bank where previous shocks that are more important remain dominant, which explains for the persistence of unemployment or the structural nature of it. So I'll go through that graph for a second. What you see on the shaded area is an index of OECD past crises that have impacted South Africa. The beginning of the series is kind of unreliable, especially in the South African sense. When we talk about unemployment, it's not so very easy to find reliable source of unemployment. However, if we fast forward toward the 2008 financial crisis, we can see that during the crisis, unemployment picks up a little bit, right? But instead of going after the crisis has ended, and we can see that from the gray area, the unemployment doesn't go back to its previous level. It just keeps going on a certain plateau. So it stays high there. This is because the fiscal space has ended, and then there was no support for the unemployed to go back into the economy. So during this period where there was no shocks in the economy, the South African economy gets impacted again by certain issues. This time domestically, we're talking about the electricity crisis, the state capture issue, where we have again a crisis between 2013 and 2015, right? And at that point, unemployment goes up at the end of the crisis. And I suppose around this time there was a commodity boom. We don't see an impact, a positive impact on unemployment. Okay. So given this evidence on the work that we did there, we decided to go ahead and proceed and model it in the labor market anyway, because we felt like it tells a better story. Okay, so I will then introduce you the model itself. As Tumi has mentioned earlier, it's a model that is following, it's in the line of what Narado Epaes has done in 2013. However, we favored more a normal rigidity modeling approach, so we decided to go with Galli-Monticelli. Okay, so we have the Galli-Monticelli framework, which we enhance to accommodate for a couple of factors that that Tumi has mentioned earlier, which is the fiscal sector, where we explicitly model the government spending, and then the debt is also incorporated, and the fiscal authority has a way of increasing its tax pool by taxing the commodity sector. Then for the reason that I just discussed in the previous slide, we accommodate for hysteresis following the paper by Galli in 2002, was done at an outsider model, and that account for hysteresis. And finally, because we're discussing commodity price shock, we also model the commodity sector. So what you see on the graph now, on the screen now, is what we would call the big picture of the economy, right? Those are the blocks that we model in the paper. So if you look at the households, basically they provide labor to the firms and then get wages from them, and they interact with the monetary policy through the interest rate, but also they interact with the world economy because they get bonds from the from overseas. And then we have the firms that take the labor from the households and pay the wages. But in the firms, we have basically three types of firms: one that produce final goods, one that produce intermediate goods, and then some of the firms operate into the commodity sector. Okay. Next, we have the commodity sector itself, where import and export operate, and then we have the government. Government interact with the firms and the households through the collection of taxes and also through government spending. Okay. And with the commodity sector, through export and imports, we can talk about tariffs, or we can talk about a channel in which government can receive tax from firms interacting into the commodity sector. Okay. Then we have monetary policies that has a Taylor rule approach, which is standard in the literature. Then we have finally the end of the economy, the world economy, where the domestic economy, which is the component below, interact with them through the terms of trade. Okay, so I will go through the equations of each of these building blocks for the next 10 minutes or so, and then give you the conclusions and our findings. So the households face a typical intertemporal utility maximization problem by deciding how much to consume and how much to work. Okay, this is standard in the literature, and they do so by facing a certain level of constraints, where that includes consumption, interest rate, bond from the government and also from overseas, and the capital that is given to the firms for investment purposes, and the capital itself that follows a law of motion, right, which is standards in the literature as well. And they face, because they get the bonds from overseas, they face the interest rate from the rest of the world, which we can model as an autoregressive process, in which we can shock an increase into the bond or an decrease into the bond in the foreign economy, and then how the impact that it has in the economy. Next, we have the final goods firms that produce a good by bundling intermediate firms' output, and they sell it at a home price of PHT. Okay, and the ratio epsilon divided by epsilon minus 1 is basically just the price markup. We move on now to the intermediate goods firms, and these firms basically typically use a Cobb-Douglas function to combine capital and hours worked or labor to produce the goods that is going to be used as an input for the final good firms. This is where total factor productivity shock enter the model, and it follows the AR process that you see on your screen as well. Still at the level of the intermediate firms, this is where we can derive what we call the Phillips curve, right, which is the relationship between prices and output gap and a marginal cost. Okay, to begin that, then we need to assume that these firms face what we call an adjustment cost, AC. Okay, and this adjustment cost is basically the cost that is taken into account by incorporating what will be the target of inflation into the economy. So they internalize those adjustment costs, and then they derive their profit maximization problem, which is subject to the output itself and how much it's used to how costly it was to produce that output itself. And also there we include wages and how much is paid regarding the whole sort of compensation of employees in the economy, and the rent that is paid on capital. Now, if we do a bit of algebra, we end up with this typical Phillips curve equation, which is basically just the inflation into the economy. Now we have a commodity sector, which for simplicity reason, we assume that it's just an endowment that involves sort of exogenously from our model, and the exports are basically taxed. And because the economy is a small economy, we have the South Africa is basically just a price taker. Okay, and the price in the labor market in the global market for commodity is defined by P star CT, which you see there. Now, when those firms operating into the commodity sector set their prices, they take into account the price at the international market, and they sort of like weight it with the terms of trade or the exchange rates between the rand and the rest of the economy. And in this case, because most of the commodities are denominated into the dollars, we assume that it's dollar in this case. And this price itself is basically how the shock commodity enters the model, so following the same the same AR1 process, okay, like we've seen for the total factor productivity and other shocks previously. So we move on now to the hysteresis part of the model. Okay, so basically wages in the economy are set at following Calvo, and this is how we introduce rigidity in the model. However, we have a situation where unions basically demand set a certain level of labor demand that is knowing information at time k in the future. Okay, and this level of labor is dependent on the elasticity of the deviation between the target wage that the union are demanding and what will materialize in the future. Okay, so a nominal wage now are faced with certain rigidity, which is theta W there. So pretty much the more rigid wages, the more it will be equal to the previous wage in the previous period. For instance, if we have theta W, which is the most extreme case, to be equal to 1, then this component here, WT star, disappear, and then we have here to be 1, and the wage will be the same. So we'll have full rigidity in the economy, which is highly unlikely. But in the case that it happens to be high, closer to 1, then you understand the principle. We are far away from the desired wages as possible. And in the they do the same scenario for the in an insider-outsider model, which I will explain in a moment now. And that's how hysteresis enters the model. Okay, so unions in an insider-outsider models pretty much decide wage by taking into account that by putting more weight on the insiders. Let me explain. So assume we have a shock into the economy, right? So we have a pool of people who are employed, and we will call them the insiders. Now, when that negative shock occurs, we have part of the labor force that will go into employment and reducing the part the size of the insiders. Now, the people who are now left the labor market to go into the employment pool will be called the outsiders. Now, assume in the future, maybe after the crisis has died out, that things improve, right? In a flexible model, what we'll assume to be the case is that the union will set a certain level of price that would allow firms to rehire the outsiders and then bring them back into the pool of insiders, right? Therefore, reducing the level of unemployment. However, in a hysteresis-driven model, what happens is that unions basically give more power to the insiders, okay? Which means that the pool can, and then they negotiate a higher wage in the future, which now increase the cost of the firms, and who will prefer to keep the insiders at a higher wage and not increase the pool size of the employed, therefore increasing the size of the pool that are unemployed and the outsider themselves. And that's how the unemployment is kept at a high level for a very long time, okay? And this is basically explained by this equation here, okay? So gamma his is our level of hysteresis, okay? And this is the target that if the economy is flexible, this is the target that employment should be in the future. However, if we have a gamma his parameter that is like that's equal to 1, then we don't care much about employment in the future, and then we care about the pool of insiders, which means that employment today would be the same as employment yesterday. Okay, so keeping unemployment at a high level. Okay, so we can also, using these previous equations, derive what we call the wage Phillips curve, which will enter the model and allow us to change the level of hysteresis and then see how the economy reacts. Okay, and this is the equation here, pretty much just wage inflation that you have in the economy. Okay, and we have done some work on the hysteresis front, and then we found that for the South Africa case, the coefficient is close to 1. Okay. So I'll rush through the end. Now we're talking about the policy. I'm going to take you to the policy part of the model, which is basically government and monetary policy. And government spending is financed by tax on home production and in the commodity sector, and the fixed tax that is given by the equation that you see on the board. Monetary policy follows a standard Taylor rule. We experiment with different fiscal rules where we assume that the government can tax capital and they can tax hours worked or labor, and they can tax also consumption. And these are calibrated by the numbers that you see on your screen at the moment, okay? And for proxy, we have for consumption standard VAT, okay? So we calibrate this model, and then these are the results that we have, okay? This is the baseline model, okay? And it's in line with what Tumi was discussing earlier. A positive commodity price shock basically just has an expansionary effect, okay? And then we have an increase in home production, total output, home prices, hours worked, unemployment goes down, wages go up. and we have decrease in government spending, and also as we found in the empirical part, we find an appreciation of the trade balance. Okay. What we also do in this slide itself is that we experiment about situations where the tax in the home production can be equal, less or higher than tax in the commodity sector. This is based by the finding that we saw in the literature, where for commodity products or goods in the South African economy, there is a fixed part and a variable part that are just royalty, and this royalty is increasing in whether the economy is doing, the firms in the commodity sectors are doing well, and they are having more revenue. Okay, so at any point in time, we can have a scenario where government tax in the home production can be less or equal or high than tax in the commodity sector. So when we do that sort of experiment, and then we tax, for instance, the commodity sector higher, then we have a scenario where the trade balance it's closer to the negative part, right? So we have a trade deficit. This is the black line, and this is basically based on the fact that the production cost of the firms operating in the commodity sector have increased, and they cannot be as profitable as possible. And because the tax has increased, tax collection has increased because the level is higher, then government spending goes high. Okay, so this is about the baseline, and then the next thing is that we experimented a bit with the hysteresis component, and we find that for labor variables to have more persistence effect if you focus on the labor here, unemployment, and then wage. So high hysteresis will be the black line. Okay, but the results remain robust because we still find an expansionary effect of the commodity price shock. Okay. Now, finally, in the interest of time, let me conclude by saying, let me take you to the final slide, because Tumi mentioned a lot of times fiscal discipline, and then we thought that, okay, why don't we just explore it in this case? Okay. So this is a case where we have a scenario where tax collected from the commodity sector, from the commodity boom, basically spent or it's saved. The windfall of the tax are saved, and in that way, you're basically doing countercyclical fiscal policy. Okay, and in our case, we still find that the results will be robust in terms of the expansionary effect of the commodity price shock. But what is more important for us is that in this case, government spending between the two options are not the same, right? So therefore, suggesting that discipline is followed, which results into a reduction in debt in that case. Okay, so those are the main findings that we found on the paper, and then let me conclude by saying that the theoretical part and the empirical part seems to be going hand in hand. And going forward, we look forward to maybe estimating the DSG model. And about the unemployment response, we believe that it could be an asymmetric response scenario. So maybe exploring a negative price shock, commodity price shock, can actually have a significant impact on the hysteresis index. But the goal here was to also sort of explore the fiscal discipline, and then it doesn't align together. And finally, the other thing that we wanted to cover was the COVID area, and then maybe sort of like build a DSG model that will account for infectious disease into the model, and then see how during that era, particularly what happened in the South African economy. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Vincent, and thank you to Tumisang for that insightful presentation. We've reached the Q&A segment of the seminar. Please feel free to raise your virtual hand if you have a question. Alternatively, you can type your question in the chat. Tumisang, I see we already have 2 questions in the chat, so I'm going to read them out. They're from Ndogozo Nzimande. The first question is, given the ongoing efforts to diversify the economy and shift towards green industrialization, how flexible is your model in capturing these kinds of structural changes, or would it need to be adapted significantly? Then her second question is, in your view, what is the most important takeaway from your findings for policymakers who are managing commodity revenue today, especially given the current fiscal constraints? I'll just check to see if we have any other questions or raised hands. I think we have one more. Let's take one more. Okay. If you could take those two questions, I don't know, Vincent, Tumisang.
And let me start, and then I think Vincent can also add. So in terms of the first question with the structural changes, so with every model, right, you always look at what the research questions and try to model that, and you always try not to make a model too complicated. So in our case, I would say that our model does not necessarily take into account these structural changes, and if one had to model it, then it would obviously have that would mean that we need to change our model. One can say yes, significantly to account for these structural changes. So in terms of the first question, I would pretty much say one would have to understand what are these structural changes and how do we then incorporate them into the model. And the second one, the main takeaway from our analysis is on, as you said, fiscal discipline. So what we're trying to show, and that's what the last slide, the last result that Vincent showed is, the importance of countercyclical fiscal policy. And that's one of our contributions, or what we're trying to capture in the paper, because if one was to look at even just the simple style aspects that we showed, the simple correlations, where you see that during the commodity boom in the 2000s, there was both an increase in we have decreased the tax windfall, but we also increased our government spending. And maybe one can argue that perhaps we could have, created a bit more buffer, so that we, weather the global financial crisis, much better. And the other thing that we also want to emphasize, in the paper, and it's quite unfortunate that our results for unemployment were not necessarily that significant, but we were not discouraged by it. It was, how to model the, unemployment in South Africa based on the empirical evidence that's been found, and how we know that, unemployment seems to be, very persistent and very structural. And what we, even though our results are not significant, we still wanted to see, how does, when government practice, in our case, countercyclical fiscal policy, one of the arguments could be that, you could, when you have fiscal discipline, so during commodity booms, what governments can do then is that when you have a negative commodity shock, right? So when the commodity prices, the effect dies out, when you practice fiscal discipline and create this fiscal buffers, then you are able then to use the revenue that you've generated and saved during the commodity boom to, in some cases, one can say, help the economy recover much better, or help industries that are negatively affected by the subsequent negative shock. So hence again, and this again goes back to unemployment. So the main two things in this paper is unemployment and fiscal discipline. And what we want to drive, and what we wanted to drive is, how can fiscal policy be used to help the South African economy weather negative shocks, especially in terms of given the high unemployment that we've had, and as Vincent shown that after the global financial crisis, pretty much unemployment has remained quite high. I don't know if Vincent also wants to add to that.
No, I think you covered all the points. I think there's nothing more that I can add. Yeah, all these issues are prominent in the South African sense, and we hope to convince you that these are certain areas that need to be sort of investigated more, and then see where the solution can be found.
Great, thank you. Are there any additional questions from the floor? Don't see any hands. Okay, I see one more in the chat. From Dogozo still, it says, in your model, both the commodity sector and home production are taxed. Could you explain the reasoning behind taxing home production and how well that reflects South Africa's actual tax structure?
Okay, Tumi can go. No, I don't know. Follow up.
Yeah. Okay, so what we're trying to capture there is that you have the commodity sector and the non-commodity sector. And where we say we tax in the commodity sector more, it's basically looking at the effective tax rate. So we know in terms of the commodities sector, so there is, as Vince has highlighted, there is the fixed portion and there's the variable portion of when it comes to corporate income tax. So during commodity booms, you would find that the commodity sectors, they would pay the fixed portion like any other company, but they would also pay there's an increase in tax revenue because there's also this variable portion that they pay based on how much they make from the commodity boom. So we basically use the current structure to model the tax revenue in the commodity sector and non-commodity sector. So when you say you tax in the commodity sector more, it's basically just capturing the fact that during commodity booms, corporate income tax increases because there are high, we get high tax revenue mainly from the commodity exporters.
Okay, and if I can add more on this, on what Tumi just said, I guess home production also gets taxed now because you have firms operating in the corporate world, but that are not necessarily related to the commodity sector. Okay, so they pay a certain level of tax. This is also what we include in our modeling, but we also target the home population, if I can put it like that. Okay, so labor tax also is included, and then we have tax on consumption for the households as well. So we try to see different approaches to how we can model how fiscal policy can extract as much out of it in terms of tax collection, and we target pretty much the main agents in our models, and then we put it together, and then we see how it behaves across time, basically.